Welcome to the Lost Roman Heroes podcast. My name is Matthew.
My name is Matteo.
And together we're diving deep into the history of Rome from its founding with Aeneas of Troy to its death with Constantine the 11th, uncovering Rome's greatest heroes along the way and ranking them.
So please join us on our adventure looking for Rome's forgotten gems, the names lost to time, kingdom, republic, or empire, east or west. It doesn't matter to us. It's all Rome, filled with lost heroes whose stories are rarely told. Listen to us wherever you get your favorite podcasts, iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, or on our website, www.lostromanheroes.com.
Now back to the Scandinavian History Podcast, hosted by Michael Shankman. And long live the Varangians!
Hi everyone. Thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the new Swedish military tactics were put to the test in the first big battle against the undefeated Imperial army. Or perhaps I should say, hitherto undefeated, because in the Battle of Breitenfeld in September 1631, the Swedes triumphed, dealing the Emperor's army a crushing blow. Tilly himself was wounded and had to be evacuated from the battlefield. That meant that he was unable to stop the disaster as his forces disintegrated and fled in every direction in the face of the Swedish onslaught. After the battle, when the dust settled and the picture cleared, Gustavus Adolphus had to make a choice. What should he do now, when all the goals he had set up for winning this war had been met? The sensible thing to do would have been to declare victory and go home, focusing on governing his kingdom and securing the succession. But if you continue listening, you'll find out what he actually did. Episode 89, Forecast Fog. The dramatic news of the Swedish triumph at Breitenfeld spread quickly throughout Europe in the fall of 1631. It was greeted with joy and enthusiasm among German Lutherans who saw this first major imperial defeat as a Protestant revenge for the destruction of Magdeburg a few months earlier. The victory had also shifted the balance of power in the Holy Roman Empire, and the political landscape was now completely changed. The crushing defeat Tilly had suffered meant that Gustavus Adolphus had reached all the goals he had set up and used when convincing the Council and the Riksdag to back the war. Any imperial threat, real or imagined, against Sweden and its control over the Baltic Sea had been decisively removed. Sweden now firmly controlled all of the Baltic Sea coast except Denmark. Russia, Poland, and the Holy Roman Empire had been blocked from direct access to the Baltic Sea. The northern half of the Holy Roman Empire, where most of its Protestants lived, was under Swedish control, or at least the Emperor had lost control over it. This success stunned and surprised everyone, including the Swedes. They hadn't expected to reach this far this quickly. Now they had to decide what to do next. Should they quit while they were ahead, start peace negotiations with the Emperor and secure a peace on Swedish terms, ending the war? Or should they exploit the weakness of the empire and push on? Perhaps march on Vienna and force the Emperor himself to bend the knee to Gustavus Adolphus, the lion from the north, protector of the Protestants. I assume you've already figured out the answer, since it's called the 30 Years' War and not the 13 Years' War. Since the goals had been achieved, new goals were drawn up on the go. On September 15th, the leaders of the Protestant side got together in Halle for a council of war, where they would decide what to do next. First of all, the German territories along the Baltic Sea coast should become Swedish possessions on a permanent basis, as a form of compensation for Swedish expenses in the war so far. And the king also wanted to set up a mirror organization to the Catholic League, a Protestant political body, a Corpus Evangelicorum, with its own standing army and political coordination, all under Swedish leadership, of course. It's not entirely clear what status this Protestant League would have within the Holy Roman Empire, but it was clear to everyone that it was a grave threat to the authority of the Emperor. Gustavus Adolphus would be on par with him, if not in titles, then at least in power. Beside the new, rather grandiose political ambitions, the military aims also leveled up. It was decided that the Saxon army should march on Vienna, putting pressure on the emperor. The Swedish army, meanwhile, should march in the opposite direction, toward the river Rhine, to mop up the last remnants of imperial resistance in the Holy Roman Empire. An illustration of how improvised it all was is that the Swedish military leadership in Germany didn't even have proper maps over the southern and western parts of the Holy Roman Empire that they had now decided to enter. But trifling details like that didn't stop Gustavus Adolphus. He left Halle and marched southwest with his army, meeting almost no resistance as they went. On September 22nd, they took the city of Erfurt, and less than 2 weeks later, they captured Würzburg. The king moved on in the middle of November, bringing with him 13,000 soldiers. The remaining 7,000 were left behind in Würzburg to keep the locals under control. In November, they marched down the main river valley, dotted with wealthy towns and villages, castles and monasteries, all untouched by war. So far. All of this was too big a temptation for the King of Sweden, so the Swedish army went for what was supposed to be a brief stint of filling up the larders for winter. But it turned out to be just a little too lucrative and too easy, so they decided to advance just a little further, and then just a little further, and then just a little further still. The army continued southwest, and wherever they went, they were met by open city gates and burghers eager to pay a fat contribution just to make the Swedes move on as quickly as possible after having done as little damage as possible. For instance, on November 17th, the great city of Frankfurt on the Main surrendered without a fight. Here and there, they did encounter some resistance, but nothing major, and any and all defenders were easily disposed of, if they didn't flee as the Swedish army drew closer. In some cases, the imperial troops even defected and joined the Swedish side. Now, in late 1631, the Swedes met the goal of having the war pay for itself. And then some. The burden of paying for the fighting shifted from the people back home in Sweden and Finland and was instead placed squarely on the population of the lands the army went through. Not only Swedish taxpayers, but also the soldiers enjoyed this turn of events. They had never eaten better than this, and they were paid in full and on time, something they were not used to. The aristocratic officers went through the collections of art, valuables, and even furniture in the castles and towns that they captured, packed up the stuff they liked, and shipped their loot off to their manors back home, which, to be honest, looked rather paltry in comparison to some of the stately homes they despoiled. This trend of decorating by plunder would continue throughout the war, and the fortunes of Swedish noble families grew beyond what most of them could have ever imagined, thanks to treasures stolen on the continent. When they returned home, many of them also had new, much grander mansions built for themselves throughout the country, mansions inspired by the ones they had seen, admired, and plundered in Germany. That's why so many of the castles and stately piles still dotting the Swedish countryside today have a certain German 17th century air about them. Needless to say, the local population watched in horror as this foreign army ravaged their homes without anyone being able to stop them. Catholics had extra cause to worry about the Swedish advances, and as Gustavus Adolphus and his forces approached, many of them chose to flee. The roads filled up, not only with monks and nuns, but also regular Catholics who feared the fiercely Protestant line from the north and what he might have in store for them. By the end of 1631, the Swedish army found itself rich, well-fed, and generally content in the city of Mainz, where the river Main joins the river Rhine, some 450 kilometers southwest of Leipzig. Here, they finally stopped and decided to spend the winter. By now, the Swedes and their allies controlled half of the Holy Roman Empire. Gustavus Adolphus had come up with a plan for what to do next and a vision for what a post-war settlement would look like. In the spring, he intended to march straight into the Habsburg heartlands, take Vienna, and force the emperor to yield to him. To achieve this new, lofty, some might even say megalomaniac goal, Gustavus Adolphus needed a bigger army. A much bigger army. In fact, he decided he needed 6 armies, and these would move through the Holy Roman Empire, crushing all resistance as they went. The Swedes estimated that they needed some 150,000 soldiers, an enormous number, almost unheard of at the time. Obviously, the modest populations of Sweden and Finland wouldn't be able to produce that number of soldiers, not even close. So recruiters had to be sent out in all directions to raise new troops. That meant that the Swedish component of the nominally Swedish army grew increasingly smaller. Soon, only about 1 in 12 soldiers was actually from Sweden. The rest were mostly German, but there were also Scottish, English, Irish, French, Dutch, Polish, and Bohemian men fighting with the Swedes. In March, this new army was put in motion. They went southeast, across the river Danube and into Bavaria, one of the richest of the Catholic regions in the empire. Only a few years previously, the leader of Bavaria, Maximilian, had been upgraded to Elector after that title had been stripped from Frederick V of the Palatinate. You know, after he usurped the current emperor as king of Bohemia before he was chased off by Wallenstein. Tilly and an army had spent the winter drumming up, had entrenched themselves and were waiting for the oncoming Swedes behind the river, hoping they'd be able to stop the invaders' march on Munich. But after a combination of a massive artillery barrage from 72 guns and an attack of the cavalry led by a Finnish contingent, the defenders broke and fled. Tilly himself was wounded in the right thigh and was escorted away from the battle. Unfortunately for the Imperial commander, the wound later got infected and he died 2 weeks later. The surviving Imperial forces dispersed, and the road to Vienna lay open. Some said the Swedes could appear at the gates in only 3 weeks. The Swedes moved on, and on May 7th, Gustavus Adolphus made his triumphal entry into Munich, the capital of Bavaria. He did so accompanied by Frederick V, the man whose seat among the electors had been taken away and given to Maximilian of Bavaria. They were met by a delegation of the city elders who greeted the King of Sweden on their knees, offering him the keys of the city, as well as a record-breaking $300,000 in contribution. Even though the city itself was spared, the palace of the Elector Maximilian was thoroughly plundered, and cartload after cartload of valuable loot were sent back to Sweden. According to the king's original plan, it was now time to march on Vienna. But Gustavus Adolphus had been reached by worrying news from the northeast, and now he was hesitating. As it turned out, the death of Tilly had been a double-edged sword for the Swedes. On the one hand, they had gotten rid of the commander of the imperial troops, and Bavaria had been left wide open and completely defenseless. But on the other, the emperor had then recalled none other than Wallenstein from his forced retirement to resume supreme command over the imperial forces. And he had wasted no time getting a new army together and starting to roll back the Swedish achievements. If Wallenstein had been brooding and ruthless before, he'd become even more so during his forced retirement. He could no longer suffer loud noises, and had even forbidden people in his vicinity to wear spurs. It was said that the first thing he did when he entered a new city or town was to have all the cats and dogs put to death, so he wouldn't have to hear them. He even traveled with his own personal executioner in his retinue, whose job it was to immediately carry out all the death sentences that Wallenstein handed out left and right. One of the victims of this system was a servant who the irritable commander condemned to death because he'd accidentally woken him up. Despite these new quirks, Wallenstein was still a brilliant military commander. He proved this by recapturing Prague, which had fallen to a Saxon army the previous fall. Now, he had turned toward Nuremberg, a Bavarian city some 170 kilometers north of Munich, which had recently joined Gustavus Adolphus's Corpus Evangelicorum. The King of Sweden decided that he needed to aid his new ally Nuremberg and perhaps even neutralize this old new threat Wallenstein before continuing to deliver the final blow to the Holy Roman Emperor himself. So instead of continuing east towards Vienna, the Swedish army turned north. Once they reached Nuremberg, they started to build trenches and beef up the city's defenses. But Wallenstein was smarter than attempting a frontal attack on a well-defended city. Instead, he encircled Nuremberg and started to wait. He didn't have to fire a single shot or risk a single life. It was enough for him to guard that no one entered or left Nuremberg. Sooner or later, the encircled city would have to yield. In other words, the Swedes had marched straight into a hunger trap. The summer of 1632 was not to be a pleasant one for them, or for anyone else in Nuremberg for that matter. In addition to the Swedish army, the city was teeming with refugees from the surrounding countryside. They had brought with them their most valuable possessions, including a lot of livestock. All these people and these animals were now cramped into an area that was far too small to house all of them. So before hunger became an issue, various diseases did. Illnesses spread like wildfire, and people and animals started to drop like flies. When they realized they were trapped, the Swedes tried to break the siege on August 24th, but the Imperial troops were too well entrenched, and the Swedes were forced back into Nuremberg with its stench, filth, death and despair. They had lost 2,400 men, whereas only some 100 Imperial soldiers had fallen. The siege couldn't be broken, so to save his army from complete annihilation in this inglorious way, Gustavus Adolphus decided to abandon Nuremberg, to break out and leave the city to its fate. And so he did. On September 8th, the diminished and demoralized, but determined Swedish army forced its way out of Nuremberg and through Wallenstein's lines. Gustavus Adolphus wanted to return to his original plan and march on Vienna, but the cunning Wallenstein ended the siege of Nuremberg as soon as the Swedes had marched off. Now, the Imperial army continued north to do to Saxony what Gustavus Adolphus had done in Bavaria in the spring. Hearing this, the King of Sweden must have cursed under his breath. He could not leave Saxony to be destroyed. Saxony was too important an ally, and if he did, the wishy-washy, peace-loving drunkard of an elector might switch sides again and join forces with Wallenstein. And if Saxony became hostile, that would threaten the lines of communication with Sweden itself, potentially isolating the king and his army in the heart of the empire. So the Swedes turned north yet again and marched as fast as they could toward Leipzig. But before they could make it that far, they were reached by the news that the Saxon capital had surrendered to Wallenstein on October 22nd. That only increased the sense of urgency, and the army pressed on through the miserable, rainy fall landscape. In 17 days, they marched more than 600 kilometers, which comes out to about 35 kilometers per day. That's almost 6 times the expected distance for a 17th century army. Again, per day, for 17 days. This was an astonishing feat, but it had come at a heavy price. Many soldiers had died along the way, and the number of stragglers were so large that Gustavus Adolphus had to stop in a place called Naumburg, some 50 kilometers southwest of Leipzig, to give all the units time to gather before they would be ready to meet Wallenstein on the battlefield. Wallenstein obviously knew that the Swedes had arrived, and he was ready to do battle. But nothing happened. He waited. He waited for 2 weeks, but the Swedes didn't make a move. Wallenstein, who didn't know that the exhausted Swedes were waiting for their stragglers and reinforcements, believed Gustavus Adolphus had decided to break off the campaign season and go into winter quarter. After all, it was already November at this point, and the weather was atrocious. So Wallenstein decided to do the same, and dispersed his units in the Saxon countryside to spend the winter living off the land of the treacherous Elector John George. That was probably the biggest mistake the otherwise brilliant Wallenstein made in all of his military career. On November 5th, the sound-sensitive Wallenstein was disturbed by 3 shots of cannon fire. This was his own troops signaling a warning that the Swedish army was approaching. At first, Wallenstein refused to believe that this was true. It must be a mistake, he thought, but it didn't take long before he was forced to admit that he had been mistaken. Gustavus Adolphus hadn't gone into winter quarters after all. He'd been preparing for battle, and now he was marching Wallenstein's way. Now, a little more than a year after the Battle of Breitenfeld in September 1631, the Swedish army had marched roughly in a triangle from Leipzig to Mainz, from Mainz to Munich, and from Munich via Nuremberg back to Leipzig. It was a journey of approximately 1,300 kilometers, and now they were back to fight another battle. The Imperial commander scrambled to get his army together. He sent word to Pappenheim in Halle to leave all he had at hand and bring his men and cannons to join Wallenstein, where the bulk of the Imperial army was currently standing, at a town 30 kilometers southwest of Leipzig called Lützen. Thanks to the season, Wallenstein gained a few more hours to get ready, because by the time the Swedish army had marched all the way to Lützen, in battle formation, the feeble November sun had set and night had fallen. Not even Gustavus Adolphus could fight a battle in the dark, so the Swedes had to wait until morning. They spent what must have been a rather uncomfortable night under the open sky, knowing that it may be their last. As the Swedes were trying to get some sleep, the Imperial troops were hardly gathering, some 5 kilometers away. As soon as day broke on November 6th, the Swedes got going. They were eager to stop the fighting, not least because they feared that every additional hour of delay would increase the number of soldiers under Wallenstein's command, and the sound of drums in the distance indicated that more troops were indeed on the way to join the Imperial army. So it must have been frustrating for the Swedes that the fog lay thick over the plains surrounding Leipzig that morning, and instead of evaporating in the morning sun, it grew even thicker. The Swedish soldiers, who had been able to see the walls of Lützen to their left and even sense the vague dark shape of the Imperial army some 1,000 meters in front of them, could eventually not see anything but thick, impenetrable white fog. The attack had to be postponed while they were waiting for better weather. Only around 11 o'clock, the wind had dispersed the fog enough to get the battle going. The Swedes marched off to meet the enemy, and they soon realized that the Imperial commanders had learned a thing or two from the Battle of Breitenfeld a year before. Gone were the heavy, inflexible Spanish square formation. Instead, Wallenstein had also arranged his troops in long lines with far fewer ranks and drilled his soldiers to shoot and reload faster. Also, the Imperial artillery had adopted Swedish tactics. The main battery was divided into 3 groups that were well placed to cover the muddy field in fire. In addition, the Imperial regiments had been provided with cannons of their own to deploy as they saw fit. When the Swedish forces eventually reached the road running from Lützen to Leipzig, they found out that the Imperial army had fortified its position behind the road, turning the deep ditches into trenches. Imperial soldiers lay well protected in these trenches and shot at the approaching Swedes. They managed to stop the attack, except to the right, where regiments of Ostrogothians, Westrogothians, Dalecarlians and Finns broke through across the road. They captured one of the 3 main artillery positions, while their comrades tried to clear the ditches from the entrenched Imperial soldiers. The fighting remained relatively static in the center and the left, closest to Lützen, but to the right, where the Swedes had broken through, the fighting moved back and forth in a confusing mess that didn't become any clearer by the fact that the fog was still pretty thick. When the smoke from the artillery was added to the mix, it became impossible to see further than 4 paces ahead. Good luck trying to keep track of what was going on under such circumstances. The Imperial position was wavering under the Swedish onslaught to the right, but at that very moment, Pappenheim appeared from the north. He had managed to gather his troops that were plundering in the vicinity of Halle and had marched all night to reach the battlefield, which they did exactly at the spot where they were most needed. All of a sudden, the Imperial forces enjoyed the numerical advantage, and they could go on the counter-offensive, which they did, of course. After heavy fighting, the Swedes had to retreat and abandon the artillery they had captured. They dragged their wounded comrades with them, but left the dead men lying. The Swedish soldiers were starting to panic, but a field chaplain then got a group of officers together and urged them to sing a hymn. This display of calm made the soldiers believe that the situation couldn't possibly be so bad, so the threatening rout was stopped before it began. The line stabilized and the battle raged on. Once again, the fighting became static along the road, but now the Swedish attention was increasingly focused on a small hill to the right, just north of Lützen. There, where the locals had built 4 windmills, an Imperial artillery battery was stationed. 13 heavy guns, some partially dug into the ground. If the Swedes managed to capture this hill, they'd not only silence a major part of the Imperial artillery, but they would also drive a wedge between Wallenstein's cavalry and his center. Sometime around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the Swedes attacked, first by a massive barrage of artillery fire and then by charging up the hill. They succeeded in taking it, but soon thereafter a determined Imperial counterattack forced the Swedes down the hill again. But they didn't give up and instead redoubled their efforts. That way, the battle for the hill with the windmills continued until sunset, when the Swedes found themselves in possession of the high ground. and by now it was too dark for Wallenstein to make yet another attempt at recapturing it. The fighting just kind of ended gradually along the front. People started to realize that the battle must be over. But who had won? It wasn't entirely clear. Perhaps a fitting end to such a confusing day. And in the general confusion, it eventually became clear that no one on the Swedish side knew where the king had gone off to. Around 1 o'clock, so only about 2 hours after the battle had begun, a servant boy on the Swedish side had caught the reins of a wounded and agitated horse that returned riderless out of the fog. The empty saddle was exclusive, but covered in blood. It was the king's horse. But where was the king? The last anyone had seen of him, he had, true to form, led a charge of a cavalry unit from Småland in an attempt to support the Swedish soldiers who'd broken through to the right across the fortified road. They had soon run into Imperial troops, and in the fog it had become all but impossible to distinguish between friend and foe. Needless to say, the fighting had been confusing. Things had then happened fast. The king had gotten lost and found himself surrounded by enemy soldiers. He was shot in the left arm from behind, crushing his left elbow. That meant the king had to drop his saber and hold the reins of the horse in his right hand. He tried to find a way out of the fighting, but got lost in the fog and moved straight into more Imperial soldiers instead. He was shot again, once again from behind. This time, the bullet hit his shoulder and punctured his left lung. One of the few Swedes who were still around tried to steady Gustavus Adolphus in the saddle, but the next bullet hit the horse, which reared from the sudden pain. Then the man trying to keep the king on the horse was shot, and he lost control of the king, who slid off the horse and down on the ground. The horse set off, but the king's left foot was stuck in the stirrup, so he was dragged along the ground for a short distance before the horse disappeared into the fog. Then 3 Imperial cavalrymen turned up and got off their horses. One of them plunged his saber through the chest of the Swedish king, whereas one of the others cut into his arm. Then they got back onto their horses and rode off. A short while later, the commander of the Imperial cavalry himself, Ottavio Piccolomini, showed up. He'd heard rumors that the Swedish king had been killed, and he wanted to see if it was true. He could conclude that the rumor was only partially true. It was indeed Gustavus Adolphus there on the ground, but the king wasn't dead. He was still breathing. Even though he was still alive, Imperial soldiers had already started to rob him of his possessions. His coat, a ring, a chain he was wearing around his neck. They then plunged their sabers into the fat, wounded man a few more times before someone walked up, put a gun to his head, and fired a shot into his temple. Gustavus Adolphus was dead. As the Swedes advanced, they finally recovered the king's body, face down in the mud. The body had been looted, and Gustavus Adolphus was naked, except for his bloody undershirt and linen socks. The King of Sweden was only one of approximately 7,000 dead that day. The survivors were exhausted. They hadn't slept well last night, and then they'd had to fight all day on an empty stomach. The command over the Swedish army was now in the hands of the Duke of Weimar, and he drew the conclusion that his forces wouldn't be able to cope with another day's battle. If the fighting resumed the next morning, the Swedes would be defeated. He decided it was time to retreat from the battlefield and gave the order to start preparations to slip away under the cover of darkness. But it took the tired Swedes a long time to get ready to march off. So long, in fact, that they eventually realized that the Imperial army, or what was left of it, had retreated themselves. It turned out that Wallenstein was every bit as worried by the day's outcome as the Duke of Weimar was. He'd been hit in the hip himself, and many of his senior officers were also wounded, including the commander of the cavalry, Piccolomini. Perhaps worst of all, Pappenheim had been killed. The army itself wasn't doing particularly well either. Wallenstein had lost all his artillery, and several units had panicked and fled the battlefield. Some Croatian cavalrymen had even plundered the Imperial baggage train before they galloped away. Then the horses used to draw the carriages had also been stolen by women working behind the lines with cooking, cleaning, and that kind of thing. They had also ridden off, away from what they assumed was a lost battle. The general morale hadn't been improved when a few wagons of ammunition had caught fire and exploded, causing confusion and panic behind the lines. Wallenstein was also worried that the Swedes would soon receive reinforcements. So he decided he needed to save what he could of his army and marched off into the night. When he heard that the enemy had pulled up stakes, the Duke of Weimar changed his orders. The Swedish army was to remain on the wet and muddy battlefield. The tired and hungry soldiers spent a miserable night without food among the dead and the dying. But at least they held the field when the dawn broke on November 7th, which meant that the Swedes could declare victory. But even though they had captured all of the Imperial artillery, the enemy had retreated from the battlefield, and their connection north toward the Baltic Sea coast and Sweden beyond was no longer threatened. This was far from the Swedish triumph that they so desperately pretended it was. The Swedes had dominated the military and political landscape for a whole year. They'd marched back and forth across the Holy Roman Empire practically unopposed, capturing castles and squeezing contributions from rich cities. But now, after the Battle of Lützen, the two sides were more or less evenly matched again. The dream of a quick victory by marching on Vienna was dead. And so was the king. What was to happen now? Who would lead the Swedes out of this mess? That is something we'll take a look at next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, why not spread the word wherever you congregate with others who are also into Scandinavian history? Also, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. Another good way to support the show is to purchase some Scandinavian history-themed merch in the Scandinavian History Podcast webshop. I especially recommend something from the Odin's Lifehack collection. It's a line of merch with quotes from Havamal, accredited to the King of the Gods. You can get t-shirts, mugs, tote bags, and many other items with nuggets of Scandinavian wisdom, such as wake up early if you want another man's land or life, only fools hope to live forever by avoiding enemies, or speak useful words or be silent. Links to these amazing products and more can be found on the Scandinavian History Podcast Facebook page. If you haven't already, then please go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Like and follow the page if you want to shop, or if you just crave more content, at least vaguely related to Scandinavian history. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. I look forward to hearing from you.